Hey guys! Okay, today we're going to tackle section 4.2, learning about carbohydrates. Now, there's a little bit of overview on the screen here. We just want to make sure we understand when we're talking about chemicals of life, specifically carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, which is another way to say fats. They all contain carbon, which is described if you contain carbon, you contain an organic molecule. You're an organic and a living being because you contain carbon-based elements. So when we look at carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fats, we're going to watch an ed puzzle here in just a few minutes that has a neat little tagline with it to help you understand and remember what's a carbohydrate composed of as far as chemical elements go, what's a protein composed of, what's a fat composed of. So carbohydrates contain carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen molecules. Lipids contain carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen as well. So if we shorten that, we can say carbohydrates and lipids are CHO, and then we have proteins that contain carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, which makes, if you take all the first letters, it makes CHON. So CHON, that's what they are created out of. That is something you will be expected to remember on several test questions, so make sure you have those in your working memory, and hopefully that corny little video that you're going to see soon helps you remember that as well. But let's just talk about carbohydrates and focus on that for just a second. Carbs are probably my most favorite food group. Let's just be honest. Pasta, bread, all the sweet, sugary things that are so good in this world, they are created of carbohydrates. But carbohydrates on a chemical level are simply long chains of simple sugars. Now I'm going to switch my screen over for just a second and show you on a chemical level what we have as far as the image of chemical bonds in a carbohydrate molecule. So you can see all the ring of the carbon in the center, and then branching out from that are oxygen and hydrogens that are bonded to that ring of carbons with that oxygen right here on one of the corners. So this is a hexagon shape, and what ultimately will happen, so we would call this a monosaccharide because it's one individual glucose molecule. So if we come back, you're going to see that, yes, glucose is the simple sugar. It's that monosaccharide, that one individual hexagon shape of the carbon ring. When we have two glucose molecules that can join together, so all of these molecules can ultimately form bonds and make like a little chain. When they form together, we would call a disaccharide, something like maltose or even sucrose. So that is when two of those chains form together from these shapes. So there would be another one that comes in here and bonds to the next side of it on either side. So if there were two, we would call that a disaccharide, and that could be something like sucrose or maltose. Okay? We also need to discuss, because each of those molecules of carbohydrates can just keep building and building and building and building, forming incredibly long chains of carbohydrates. So what we call that is a polysaccharide, because there's several of those individual hexagon shape individual carbohydrates bonded together. Now, when we get a polysaccharide, we refer to them as starches, glycogen, or cellulose. And I have an image here that can kind of help you decipher where are these taking place. Now, when we talk about humans, important to note right here in this depiction, the long chains of carbohydrates we refer to as glycogen. So we store our long chains of carbohydrates in the form of glycogen in our liver cells, which are in the liver. Okay, so glycogen for when we need a quick boost of energy and we need glucose, there's a process that we're going to learn about where ultimately glycogen is used, and we have a process that cuts off the molecules of those sugars to go where they need to go to provide for us energy. Now, in other things like plants, these polysaccharides, these complex carbohydrates, are stored as something called cellulose in the cell wall. So think about it this way. When a plant dies, you can still grab a flower that's dead, right, in a vase. If you've ever seen a flower that dies, it's still pretty firm in structure. It's because of the cellulose that's in the cell walls of those plant cells, okay? And that comes from the cell wall being created and made of those carbohydrates. And then other places where carbohydrates are stored in plants, we refer to as starch, and it's stored in the chloroplast, so it can have readily available energy to carry out photosynthesis. So just remember, when we're talking about complex carbs, you always want to think glycogen is in humans, cellulose and starch, those are going to be found in plants. All right, so that's it for carbohydrates.